Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Low Season Traveller Insider Guides, brought to you in partnership with our very good friends at Tourism Ireland. I'm Jed Brown, your host for this week's episode, and for today we head back over to Dublin, where I spent a wonderful 3 days in the low season month of January earlier this year. With clear blue skies, low crowds, and plenty of things to experience and do, Dublin rarely disappoints in the winter months. And what better way to pass the time than meeting up with some wonderful local people like today's guest, Simon O'Connor, who's the director of the Museum of Literature Ireland, or MoLI as it's better known. MoLI is a museum of literature for the world's greatest storytellers. A tranquil oasis on St Stephen's Green in the heart of Dublin, MoLI is where visitors from all over the world come to discover Ireland's rich literary heritage from past to present via its immersive exhibitions and rare treasures from the National Library of Ireland. And it is an utterly inspiring place which I had the pleasure of passing a few hours in before meeting up with Simon in his curator's office, where we met up to find out more about Ireland's literary past. Enjoy. Welcome to the Low Season Traveller Insider Guides podcast, Simon.
How are you, Jed?
Great to have you on the show. First of all, Simon, just tell us a little bit about where we are here in the MoLI.
So we're at MoLI. We're sitting in the Museum of Literature Ireland in my messy office on the top floor of number 86 St Stephen's Green, which is the south side of the main park in the middle of the city centre, and the museum is set across three beautiful old buildings, two quite fantastic Georgian buildings actually, and then one Victorian exam hall. And it was the original home of University College Dublin, so that's the biggest university in Ireland. And they partnered together with the National Library of Ireland to create this new museum of literature, which opened 6 months before the pandemic, September 2019, to a lot of international attention actually, because there aren't many large museums of literature around the world. It makes sense, I suppose, that Ireland would have one. We, as a small little island out in the Atlantic, we have a habit of producing writers who go off from the island around the world. So we're quite well known, I think, internationally as a writer-producing nation, and it was nice to create something that I suppose not just locals, but that international visitors can come and see, and I suppose put some of those writers in context and encourage them to go off and read the books as well.
And what kind of exhibits can people expect to find here, and what's the experience going to be like for visitors that come?
So, I mean, in a way, we've really conceived of MoLI as first and foremost a place where people would really be happy to be in. So it's, and I mean, there are exhibitions, and we can talk about those in a sec. It's a very, very beautiful architectural environment. It's large and quite Warren-y. So it's the type of place you can really get lost in, and is very, very chilled out. You know, there's a kind of, we get an awful lot of feedback actually about the vibe of the place, which is really down to all of our staff. You know, we've a lot of really passionate literary staff hanging out here. Yeah. And we've got amazing volunteers, and we have beautiful gardens at the back. The only Georgian house garden that's publicly accessible in the city centre, actually, one of the only ones remaining. So you can go out into those gardens and sit and read a book. We have a beautiful cafe restaurant downstairs, which is a destination in its own right, the Commons. Yeah. And then our own gardens open up then into a park at the back called the Ivy Gardens, which Dubliners here call the Secret Garden, because most of them have never been to it. So it's like this little oasis in the middle of the city. It's not far more than just simply a museum with some exhibitions. It's a place where you might come for 3-4 hours at a time. And the exhibitions themselves then range from, I suppose, what we would typically call glass box exhibitions, where you have old things in display cases, right up to some really, really high-tech interactive components. We work an awful lot with artists from all disciplines as well to create very unusual installations. So in that way, we're very contemporary. We're probably closer to a contemporary art museum than, say, a history museum. And there's a big focus in particular on the work of James Joyce, because Joyce was a student in these buildings as a young man.
Yeah.
And we have on display here the Joycean treasures from the state's literary collections from the National Library. So a lot of Joyce's Ulysses notebooks, a lot of really, really rare editions and edited pages, and then his own copy of Ulysses, which is the very first copy that was ever printed.
Wow.
So that's a kind of, in a way, nearly a pilgrimage point for a lot of book lovers.
Do most of the guests that come here, are they usually already familiar with the works of the likes of Joyce?
Somewhat, and in particular, it is a museum that's very much enjoyed by locals as well as international visitors. And we certainly don't assume any prior knowledge on the part of anybody coming in. And like any museum, we don't just focus on an audience that's going to be familiar with the subject. We actually, a lot of our work is, focusing on people who maybe have no interest in writing, or don't believe it's something for them, or feel intimidated by it. So we do an awful lot of work here as well with young kids. We often have exhibitions that are aimed at younger children. We've a room at the top of the building which actually has the best view, by the way.
Right.
So only people with very young children discover that. But that's specifically for them, actually, for people coming up with babies, toddlers, pre-reading age, to engage in activities that might encourage them to kind of get into books as well.
Yeah. I did notice that there was, so I came here yesterday to have a look around, and I was here for about 2 hours, and it was. I think you sort of mentioned before. It is like an oasis. It's a very calming place, and what I particularly enjoyed. So I've never read any of the. I'm embarrassed to say I've never read any of the great Irish works, but as a result, I kind of have been a little bit inspired to, because in a lot of the different exhibitions there are a number of passages and quotes, which are obviously incredibly well written. And even for somebody like myself who would be relatively ignorant of good writing, good writing when you see it, you feel it. And with a lot of those kind of quotes and passages, it kind of inspired me. What I actually loved as well is there was another part of the exhibition where it was encouraging people to be creative and to try writing. And there was a few quotes from famous Irish writers.
Yeah.
Basically sort of outlining how they would encourage people to start, and words of wisdom. I thought that was fabulous as well.
It's one of my favourite pieces actually of the exhibitions, and it's, in a way, the way it's designed, it's nearly the last thing that people will see. And rather than finishing with an exhibit that was looking back, we wanted to finish the exhibitions with something that was looking forward. So within that as well, there are all these interviews with those writers that you can listen to on these speakers that are hanging from the ceiling. It's a really cool idea, and they talk about their own writing process. So and it completely demystifies it. I mean, they're basically, nearly all of them, to a man and woman, are saying, you got to get up in the morning, you got to go in, you got to do your 2,000 words. It doesn't matter whether it's good or bad. You got to go back and edit it, and I think that's a lot of what our work is as well. Is making the art form itself accessible and saying, actually, you can do this too. You can come in and you can start this too, and we're using the living writing community to help us do that. But I'm glad you said that you were here for that much time and that it felt so chilled out, because I do think, particularly in museums and galleries now, one of the roles that we have is nearly to be a place of, solace, reflection and calm, as the world increasingly gets more and more complex and demands more and more of our time, and tries to sell us more and more things. These are the spaces that we need to be able to come into, and I don't know, like health spas for the mind, in a way. Yeah,
it's a place of contemplation, and like you say, you sort of switch off from everything else. I thought that was fabulous. We were sort of just speaking just before we started recording this, and we were just sort of saying how, for a small island of a relatively small population, Ireland has produced an incredibly large number of writers and creatives. I just wanted to know how and why. How did that how did that come? How did that come to be? How is it that one small island can produce just such a huge number of talented writers?
It's I mean, I suppose there are romantic answers to that, and I think I said earlier on there are geological answers to that. I mean, it rains a lot here. I often think like people people had to sit in a lot, and we talk a lot here as well, and we talk in our own version of English. And I mean, we would sometimes, there might be a kind of a joke sometimes in Ireland that the English colonised Ireland, but then we colonised the language, ourselves. And we're quite proud, actually, of what we call Hiberno English, and the way we speak to each other. And it's like conversational Olympics in Ireland sometime. And you go to anywhere, Dublin, Cork, Galway, Kerry, like any of these places, and it's like that. So there's a love of language for a start. There's always been a great storytelling tradition on the island anyway, from pagan times right up to the present. So that's something that's always been in the culture. I mean, you can go down the road here to the Book of Kells and in Trinity College, and you can see like the bookmaking culture that has existed here, and it's kind of I mean, it's practically unique and kind of exalted within the world, like what was going on here in the monastic settings. I think as well, particularly the kind of the tumult of history from the middle of the 19th century and the famine up until the present day, in the 20th century, it has been a really raucous, kind of complex time for this island and the people who live here. I mean, we had the Great Famine at the latter half of the 19th century with a huge amount of emigration. We had, I suppose, a period that would be referred to as the Gaelic Revival, where kind of politically, as the nation was beginning to kind of desire to move away from Ireland, a lot of that was being prompted by a look back at our own traditions, and at the native traditions of the island, the kind of the religious traditions, the storytelling traditions, the mythological traditions, and all of that actually fed. I mean, that fed into the revolution. And when we had what's called the Easter Rising of 1916 against colonial rule here, that was, I mean, most of those rebels were poets. They were dramatists. They were songwriters. It was what you might call a velvet revolution, and then after that, we gain independence. And we enter into and the way these things tend to go as well. Like, I mean, it kind of goes in progressive and then it comes out really, really conservative. And we entered into a period that was quite censorious, that was very difficult for the arts, and it was a very complex time for society as well. I mean, Ireland kind of cut itself off from a lot of international trade and isolated itself, the governments of the time, and writers were writing to that, like, I mean, the writing became a political act and a quiet kind of political act of subterfuge sometimes. So there's always been that tradition in a way, I think, and as we're in a literary renaissance now here in Ireland, I think what's exciting about that renaissance is that it really feels like the writing community has stepped out of the shadow of these older writers. Finally, and although we were influenced obviously by Beckett and by Joyce and by Yeats and by all these people, now there's something truly new that's not just coming from them; it's coming from itself, and that's really exciting as well.
Absolutely, it is. One of the first exhibits downstairs that you come across when you come here is about a lady called Peg. Is it pronounced Peg?
Peg Sayers.
Peg. Peg Sayers.
Yeah.
And she sounds like an incredible lady. Can you just tell us a little bit about Peg?
There was an academic in a documentary about Peg actually a couple of years back referred to her as the Netflix of the island that she lived on. So Peg Sayers was, I mean, we're an island out in the kind of west of Europe in the Atlantic, and then at the kind of southwest corner of our island is a small archipelago called the Blasket Islands, And they're opposite a very beautiful place called Dunqueen and Dingle, kind of just around the kind of south, the bottom of the southwest. And Peg Sayers was a woman who lived on the Great Blasket, which is the big, kind of the biggest one. It's actually, what's visible from it is Skellig Michael, which some of your listeners may have seen in Star Wars.
Right.
So it's kind of that bit of Ireland's really beautiful part of the country. But the Blaskets were a bit of a last chance saloon for people. So if they ran out of if you ran out of your tenancy on the land down in the southwest, I mean, one of the last places you could kind of end up was the Blasket. So there were only 4 generations that ever lived there. And the first generation, they weren't even fishermen. They lived off the seal community. There's like the seal population that lived on the island. And then eventually they learned how to build boats and then they would kind of come in and out from the mainland. But 4 generations, and they produced a throng of great storytellers. And then chief among them was this woman, Peg Sayers. So she lived much around the same time as Joyce, basically from the latter half of the 19th century up until the middle, kind of just around the middle of the 20th. And while he's in Paris, in the kind of centre of the European avant-garde, this autodidact, she's also also an autodidact in terms of just like the memory that she has. They reckon she had 350 and upwards stories in her head that she could kind of recount. And she's living in this tiny island community, and they're all going around to her on a Sunday evening to listen to her telling stories, to tell the next instalment of whatever saga, But she became, in a way, an international folklore celebrity. People started coming over folklorists started coming over from the British Museum, from Sweden, from Finland, from Germany, when they discovered that out there in the Atlantic on this tiny island, there was a woman who was an unbelievable storyteller and telling all these stories. And a lot of them it was European folklore as well that had been kind of kind of transformed into Irish. And she was telling them all in her own language. And it was a huge thing. They were going over, they were learning Irish, they were transcribing it, they were recording it, they were taking pictures. It created, a piece of economy for the islands as well. And she ended up on the school syllabus here in Ireland, and which everybody thought was really miserable because it was her first memoir, which was quite basically about the kind of tougher periods of her life. Yeah. But an amazing woman, and we had always wanted to do an exhibition on her and the folklorists actually who went out and the collecting of all that material.
So all of that, those the 350 odd stories that she had, they've all been documented.
I mean, everything, pretty much like everything recorded down from her, and her son was very involved in that. The various folklorists were involved in that. There are a number of collections of her tales, and many of them would be kind of episodes from her life. Some of them would be episodes from Islanders' lives. Some of them would be like folk stories that you and I would know from when we were kids, but they've kind of been turned into kind of local rural Irish stories. Just the way folklore travels like that and moves through communities. So an amazing storyteller. And, at the time as well, the government here created a department of folklore where they sent guys out on bicycles around the country recording stories from rural areas. So there was an interesting political thing happening where this is, kind of part of the new state trying to establish another mythical identity for Ireland, which is, the rural paradise. And, and so, these are simpler people, but are steeped in story and are, and they have these kind of idyllic lives, which totally wasn't the case. Like, I mean, they were like dirt poor, Some of the British Museum's staff, Robin Flower's photographs of, say, Tommaso Crahon, who was one of the great storytellers from the Blasket, standing outside his cottage. I mean, it's like, it's a hovel. Like, that's what it is.
Grim.
Yeah.
That's gas. What about obviously there's a lot of the old writers. Is there a new generation of storytellers now coming out of Ireland? Is it a period of optimism for the art?
Yeah, completely. I mean, we would have there's a room that you may remember walking into that we call Joyce's Century, and it's a kind of a constellation of Irish writers, goes around in a curve, and there's kind of a few hundred of them actually, and it's all writers published in the 20th century, and our reputation, at least even domestically, sometimes feels like it rests on 4 or 5 old dead guys. Whereas in actual fact, all throughout the 20th century, we had male and female writers travelling the world, gaining international reputations. We had writers writing in the Irish language as well as the English language. There's that whole culture as well. But we decided when we were making that exhibition, we were like, we have to just do it in the 20th century, because if we go over into the 21st century, we're going to need another 4 or 5 rooms. There are just like there are so many people getting involved in writing now. We've particularly as well in the universities, like out in UCD, there's an amazing creative writing school, and they're producing writers who are, like they're getting book deals. They're being published. Trinity College is the same. They have a similar thing. Like most of your listeners will probably be familiar with Sally Rooney. Like Sally Rooney is one of these up and coming, was one of these up and coming young writers. Certainly has up and come at this stage. But she was published in, we have literary magazines like The Stinging Fly, that are platforms for these young writers now, and then they're going off and getting great book deals, and then those things are being turned into TV series, and then that's just on the fiction side, and then you've got the explosion in poetry writing that's happening as well. So you've got all of these amazing young poets coming up, and some of those aren't even, like, it's not even the written word, it's spoken word. So you have all of these spoken word performers, incredible rappers and hip hop artists, people who are coming in really interestingly. They might be kind of second or third generation immigrant writers, kids like 17, 18 years of age, and they're writing and rapping and delivering spoken word performances in 3 and 4 languages at the same time. So it's this, and in a way, what's exciting for us in the museum is that we just have to look at all of that and think this is all part of the lineage that comes from Joyce, and comes from pre-Joyce. It comes from the storytelling of Peg. It goes back into the kind of the bardic traditions and the gathering of myths and these epic tales that we had. And then this is how it is today, because people are coming into the island, people are changing, the cultures are changing all the time. There
was one. I did an interview on Monday with a guy who runs a comedy club, actually, of all things, and he was a very, very interesting guy. But he put me on to one poet whose name escapes me. But one of the poems that he performs these poems, it looks like he's on the back of a farm. There's a corrugated iron. It looks like a shed behind him.
Right.
And the poem that was pointed out to me, and it's on YouTube, so if anybody out there just searches for it, it's called "Was It For This?" And it blew me away. And it's only got something like, it's got about 7,000 views on YouTube, which is not a huge number at the end of the day. I'd never heard anything so incredibly creative, and it was like an Ed Sheeran song or an Eminem rap or anything. It was incredibly well delivered and incredibly powerful. And then I searched another one, and there's another one which is called "Before You Kick the Chair," which actually is about a little bit about depression and suicide, and it's basically saying, before you kick that chair, I want you to know X, Y. Phenomenal. And I'd never, it's that, I get goosebumps now.
Yeah.
It's that power, like you say, of the spoken word. And I was just thinking, this is a guy, and I'd never heard of him, and I wonder how many people in Ireland have heard of this guy. And there must be thousands that would be as talented as that, and it just...
Yeah, we have a lovely piece of programming that happens every month here. On the first Friday of every month, it's free into the museum. We stay open late till 9 p.m, and there's lots of events happening around the museum. And it's this, in audience development terms, it's like, okay, we'll kind of try and do something for the 20 to 30s before they go up to Camden Street and get hammered. We'll try and kind of build up a few brain cells or whatever before they burst them. But actually, we program lots of really young artists, really young writers, spoken word artists, into that first Friday slot. And actually, like, it's a whole range of age groups come to it because it's a brilliant night here in the museum once a month. But there is no end of people that we could be programming in there.
Yeah.
And actually, it's the most successful piece of our programming.
That's incredible,
You know,
isn't it?
So not only are these young artists coming up and making the work anyway. I mean, they're going to make it in a pub. They're going to perform this anywhere on the side of the street. But they're bringing audiences, like they're kind of building audiences themselves. The type of thing that you would have seen, like DIY scenes in music years ago, for example. There's a lot more now in the literary scene. There's a lot more, you know, homemade literary journals coming up, chapbooks, like poetry chapbooks being released, you know, kind of outside of the publishing industry, all of that. So it's it's a really healthy literary scene here, all the way up then to, you know, the big literary festivals that we have over the course of the year as well. You know, there's all of that happening. It's I mean, there's a whole thing to be done on literary tourism in this country. Yeah. You know, because there's just so much on, you couldn't keep up with it.
I agree. Yeah. I think it's look, you know, like we say, we're here during the low season, and the kind of people that that travel during the low season, they do want to learn about the culture and the heritage. And I'd have to say to all of our listeners, I couldn't recommend highly enough this place. It's just it was a real eye opener for me. Good. And it was my first time here. I didn't realise it was so new, to be honest. Yeah. For some reason, I would have had an assumption that there would be a museum of literature. For the past 40 years.
Well, that was one of. I mean, that was one of the interesting things about setting it up too. Was that you know, when the project started? I mean, I came on board kind of, I suppose, near its completion in a way, just a few years before it opened. But there was a real sense within the community, like the kind of the artistic community of. That was like, it was really obvious idea.
How did nobody think of that before?
Nobody think of that one before, you know. Yeah. It's great that we have it, and it is a very forward-looking institution. You know, it's not a museum that just has a bunch of dusty old first editions. You know, in actual fact, and you probably discovered this as well, there's lots of books around the place that people can pick up and read. Yes. It's as much a place for people to come and sit down and read. And, you know, one of the things that really bugs me about museums and galleries is that the seating is really uncomfortable. Yeah. You know, whereas to me, like, it's a real success if someone falls asleep in one of our chairs. I'm just like, good.
Job done.
Good, job done. So it's always like, get the comfy sofas, you know, like that's what you need in a museum of literature. Yeah. Like, you want people to just be able to sit here and go, I don't have to go anywhere for a few hours.
That's brilliant. Yeah. Simon, sadly, we're at the end of our time. I want to thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us. Really appreciate it.
It was all a pleasure.
I feel I could speak to you for hours, actually. But greatly appreciate your time, and wish you all the best for the forthcoming year.
Real pleasure. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you.
So there you have it. And if you're interested in learning more about the museum, or indeed would like to plan a visit during your next trip to Dublin, you can learn more by visiting MoLI.ie. But that's our show for this week. Thanks, as always, for your company. And if you enjoyed this podcast, please do leave us a positive rating and review on your podcast app. And also, don't forget to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn to be the first to hear our latest low season stories, articles, and guides. Have a great week wherever you are, and remember that travel is always better and fairer for the planet, the local communities, and you, the travellers, when it's without the crowds.